Do Jews run the world? Does Israel control U.S. policy? Both these questions, I say no. Does Israel have an outsized influence on U.S. foreign policy? Yes, I would say that's true. However, Israel has not always been able to sway our politicians, and the fact that they can do so isn't entirely their fault. Part of what we want to get into here is looking for an exit ramp to our current foreign policy feedback loop with Israel. So, what are my personal beliefs on Israel? I think it's important for you to understand that, to understand whether I'm being objective or not. I do believe both sides, Palestinians and Israelis, have legitimate claims. I think both sides have a reason to feel aggrieved. Both sides have done absolutely horrible things to each other, and both sides have legitimate reasons to never forgive the other. I don't have religious beliefs that require the existence of Israel. I don't subscribe to any weird leftist ideas of randomly picking one group and claiming that they forever have title to a land due to a quirk of history or due to the color of their skin. If it had no effect on me at all, I'd happily let them fight it out of sight on the other side of the planet for as long as they want to. But it doesn't work out that way. It does affect me. So let's go over how we got here and work towards how we can fix it. So in 1948, Truman recognized Israel, and he actually did it completely against the desires of the entire U.S. foreign policy and security establishment. The FDR doctrine was explicitly against supporting colonial endeavors, which at that time, most people looked at Israel essentially being a Western colony in the Middle East. Now, we saw that essentially our foreign policy establishment wasn't pro-Israel during the Suez Canal crisis. Egypt attempted to nationalize the canal. France, Britain, and Israel collaborated to seize the canal. And Eisenhower pretty much shut that down. He uh, basically forced Israel to pull back from the canal and pretty much made it that those three powers weren't going to be doing anything, especially France and Britain in that area, for some time to come. His goal was to try to keep Israel on ice, and basically keep it in the background, and try to create what was deemed to be like Arab NATO. The idea was getting all the Arab nations to band together to help keep the Soviets out of the Middle East. The Arab states demanded arms as a sign of the U.S. intentions. And the United States was pretty much no on that too, because they didn't want to upset the balance of things. And so the Arabs balked at the idea of an anti Soviet organization because, as far as they were concerned, Israel was a European vassal and a much greater threat to them based on proximity. So the US had to settle on having Iran and Turkey as its frontline nations to slow down future Soviet incursions. Now, JFK tried to maintain the subtle balance of the Middle East by not overtly taking sides, despite Soviet arms flowing into the region. He did allow the sale of Hawk anti air missiles to give Israel improved defensive capabilities in the face of Arab air forces that were increasing in quantity and quality. He was careful to make sure that the U.S. did not alter the dynamics of the Middle East. Privately, he pushed Israel to allow U.S. inspectors into their nuclear program for counterproliferation reasons. He did not want Israel to get the bomb. So essentially, they wanted to watch their progress, which is something Israel, as far as I know, did not agree to. Now, LBJ, on the other hand, began cozying up to Israel. He made it clear in secret channels that the U.S. was going to look the other way when it came to Israel's nuclear program. He was very keen to send them offensive weapons. And the 1967 war, in which Arabs essentially were moving into position to potentially blockade Israel. Israel launched a kind of preemptive attack to essentially prevent themselves from getting blockaded. Uh, when the war was over, Israel's supply of weapons and ammunition were incredibly low, so LBJ took the opportunity to restock Israel with offensive weapons for the first time. Why this change? Well, first, the Jewish voting bloc was starting to become important in the large cities. LBJ was a commensurate politician, and LBJ did have a personal affinity with the state of Israel, although it doesn't appear that was derived from his religious beliefs. And a lot of it just came down to LBJ was really stupid. And if you look at how he handled the Vietnam War, you wouldn't argue that case. Maybe we'll get into that at a future point. So Nixon continued this sharp tilt towards Israeli security. Now, for Nixon, it was much more pragmatic. Cold War was at a pivot point. Essentially, he knew the United States was pulling out of Vietnam. It looked like basically a big chunk of the world was going to fall to the communists. And so he was basically trying to create new hard points that would be harder for the communists to crack. So the US provided Israel with massive arms airlift as the Yom Kippur War was launched against Israel. Essentially, this was done whereas LBJ waited till the war was over and restocked after. Nixon was restocking while the war was in progress. Nixon also told Israel that the US would back off on the whole nuclear program thing as long as Israel remained ambiguous as to what they had in their arsenal, and also if they never did an overt test and never confirmed that they had a bomb. The main result of this was the Yom Kippur War scared the Israelis. They concluded that they could not depend on their own arms industry for defense, nor could they depend on piecemeal sales from other countries. So they ramped up a sophisticated lobbying system to guarantee a flow of arms from the United States. Now, Nixon fully backed this idea. And because he, being a pragmatist, was looking for all foreign aid turns into kickbacks at some point, and he was looking for the kickbacks to come back to the Republican Party. Nixon also warned Israel that trying to maintain their own domestic arms industry at scale was essentially counterproductive. It was beyond their means. They were too small of a country. It'd be too easy to take it out. It was smarter to have arms production over in the United States where nobody could take it out. So this is a critical part of the influence trade. Israel needed weapons from outside their country in order to maintain military dominance. The United States lobbying system is part of how our establishment operates. And the US system is far more open to money flowing in than any other industrialized nation. Or at least it appears so to us. In other words, Israel had to go somewhere for weapons. And the United States is pretty much the only place it can go. Keeping that pipeline open is critical to them, so they pay handsomely to do it. Now, there's additional reinforcement to that because now we have this essentially military aid going over. Essentially, our foreign aid to Israel functions kind of like almost like a weapons voucher where they essentially have to turn it around, buy US weapons with it. So now the weapons manufacturers have a huge stake in keeping the military equipment flowing. They lobby as well, which amplifies the Israeli effect. On one hand, Israel is clearly the strongest individual power in the region. They could likely take on a bunch of their neighbors simultaneously. Their current diplomatic position rests on the fact that their military prowess, which is implicitly understood, would not be possible without US equipment. So for people who say, well, Israel's not the underdog, they're right. However, without the US equipment, the respect they have built up over time for Israel's military would essentially rapidly go away. If the United States just suddenly cut them off, Israel probably would be able to fight one last good war, bleed out their reserves, and then after that, they would be struggling. So cutting Israel off from US equipment wouldn't instantly end them as a country, but it would put them on the brink. So they treat it as if their existence is at stake. Lobbying Congress is only a part of lobbying Congress is part of their survival strategy. There's an additional issue. 15 to 20% of the US population is either dispensationalist or at least agrees with the dispensationalist aspects of Israel. What is dispensationalism? Very complicated. That'd be a whole new video, but we'll get into the gist that's applicable here is for a large chunk of history of the various Christian, essentially Orthodox, Catholic, and even early Protestants, whenever the Bible says Israel, when it's talking about prophecy, future, or current, it's interpreted to mean that the church is the inheritor of Israel. So whenever Israel is being referenced, it's actually talking about the church. Dispensationalism popped up in the early 1800s, and they postulated the idea that Israel actually means a political entity. And so dispensationalists and people who are adjacent to that thought process believe Israel must be there for future prophecy. So this causes an interesting effect too, is whereas so overwhelmingly this is in Protestant circles, but not all Protestants believe this. But we do know that Israel uses educational money to help influence dispensationalists so that they essentially stay in that camp. So it would seem like there's a pretty obvious fix to this. And it sounds like, well, it should be the easiest way to do things, but I'm going to explain to you that you can't. First, talking about lobbying. Everyone would love to get rid of lobbying. Everyone says, why is this legal? Why do we do this? Isn't it just bribery? Blah, blah, blah. Lobbying has been around probably since the beginning of the Republic. And nobody speaks about actually doing away with it once they're in a position of power. Sometimes they talk about tweaking it around the edges. And even Trump, with a populist agenda, has pretty much ignored the idea of lobbying. So I think lobbying is such an intrinsic part of our establishment that it really can't be done away with. It'd be nice. That would be my first take on it, but I don't think it's possible. So other people say, well, let's just get rid of foreign aid. Wouldn't that be easy to do? Well, the problem is foreign aid, like I was mentioning before, generally comes with a feedback loop. The foreign aid is part of the lobbying system. We send money overseas, and essentially the politicians there send money back for lobbying to keep that money flowing. And it's an understood thing. So getting rid of foreign aid is essentially the same thing as trying to get rid of lobbying because they're part and parcel in the same. They're a loop. But trying to get rid of Israeli aid would be even more difficult than the rest of it because it has a much larger group of supporters. Consider that you have, as I mentioned before, you have the issue with essentially it's foreign aid, so politicians are getting money for that. It's military aid, so our arms manufacturers are working on are backing it as well. And we have 15 to 20% of the population that believes that Israel must exist for prophecy to come to fruition. They're not about to just suddenly change your mind. Consider that uh, we have less people backing corn subsidies, probably in the 1 to 2% range in our population. And we can't get rid of corn subsidies. So, how on earth would we be able to get rid of uh, something that people literally believe religiously to be true? That number of 15 to 20% of the population. Now, in order to break down the mechanisms that have put Israel and the US uh, into this situation, requires getting down to the root. In terms of how do we fix this? And in my mind, I think this might be what Trump is attempting to do. Now, the Abraham Accords are setting the stage for creating an economic and military alliance between the Arab states and Israel as a counterweight to Iran and other Shiite aligned factions. And I don't understand why people ignore the Abraham Accords. They're probably one of the most substantial things that have been occurring in the Middle East since Trump began this in his first term, and everyone's pretending it's like background noise. And it literally explains almost everything going on in the Middle East, including the current Gaza Israeli war and how it's eventually going to shake out. This is spelled out. So the Abraham Accords would essentially unite the Arab states and Israel into an economic and military bloc. They would have improved economic cooperation, which would most likely boost all the economies of the region. Coordinated military efforts will allow the partners of the agreement greater military capability at a much reduced cost. So, how it would work is it would leverage the non-oil state manpower, like Egypt, which has a large population but little oil. This manpower could be harnessed for both ground forces and industrial labor, essentially defense industries being put up. Arab oil states would contribute the financial resources, and Israel would bring technology, military prowess, and security for the oil states. But the big problem in all this is what we call the Palestinian Arabs. Israel can't fulfill its side of the Abraham Accords as long as the Palestinian Arabs remain a hostile presence. There is no world where things go back to where they were before the October 7th attacks. They're not just going to say, oh, well, we'll just go back to the way things were and we'll just put up with attacks coming out of there, piecemeal, for the next 20 years. That's not going to happen. Also, it's unlikely that there's a future where there's a co-equal Palestinian state, meaning it won't be a country of Israel and a country of Palestine that are both completely running their own affairs and independent. Okay, that could happen, but I think it's highly unlikely. I think the best the Palestinians can hope for is to be a semi autonomous territory of Israel. And if what's kind of playing out in Gaza right now continues, they might end up being a semi autonomous territory under control of various world powers. In short, the Palestinians will have three options. The first is capitulate, meaning completely lay down their arms, stop fighting, and basically put up with whatever governance is put upon them. Their next option is they could leave. Apparently, if you look at part of what they've been saying, that is one option they're being given. They may leave. The third option is die. If they keep fighting, Israel's just going to keep coming back. It's not going to change. So why is this any why is this good for getting Israel to stop messing with our internal affairs? If Palestine is pacified in some way, Israel will have secure borders and it will be in a position to support and back up the Abraham Accords. That will free it to basically continue this. Don't call it a union, that's probably an overstatement, but basically this alliance with the Arab states. If it can protect itself, it won't desire a full time protector, i.e., the United States, on the other side of the planet. And an alliance with a larger area and more resources can set up long term, high survivability stockpiles of weapons and ammunition. If they can set things up, in southern Saudi Arabia or some of the other countries that have signed on, maybe far off in Egypt, well out of range of what even Iran can do in terms of missiles hitting their stockpiles, they don't have to worry as much about depleting everything they have. They can basically they can stockpile for multiple wars in the future. So they wouldn't have to worry about having to have the United States come resupply every time something boils over in the region again. So the short of it is our political system functions entirely from an unsolvable political problems where you have two sides paying in order to keep the pro and con of every issue. Israel is one part of the system. The United States is the other part of the system. I would love to see that system torn down, but I really don't think that's ever going to happen. Is the Israeli influence issue is a single component. It's not going away because in addition to Israel, there's defense contractors and there's 15 to 20% of the US population. That will prevent it from being fixed from our side of things, from the political contribution consumption side. The solution is to end the problem. So, is Trump's Abraham Accords a good idea? I'm not entirely sure. I've doubted what Trump has been trying to do before, and somehow they seem to make things work. So who knows? This may come around and actually work the way they want it to. Will it work? Now that's hard to say. Everything in the Middle East always seems to go wrong, especially when the United States is involved. Our system of graft and bribery won't allow disengagement as long as US money flows to Israel. Too many people are too attached to Israel to allow the money spigot to be turned off. The only solution is an Israel that doesn't need our arms and money. If they have their own money within their alliance from the oil Gulf states, if they have places where they can stockpile, if they have depth, this may be an Israel that doesn't need our arms and money, or at least one that needs a lot less. If we have a future Israel that doesn't feel like it's on the brink of extinction, they won't be so motivated to be constantly trying to alter the way the United States establishment functions. So obviously, events are moving very quickly over there. The current Gaza peace plan isn't directly part of the Abraham Accords, but pacifying the region is. So, how that plays out leads into whether the rest of the Abraham Accords can be played out. So, comment below. Do you think it would be possible to stop lobbying in this country? I mean, yeah, again, let's be nice, but can it be done? Am I missing something on that? You see what I'm talking about in terms of the loop back. We give them money. They send money back to basically influence our politicians to keep the money flowing. Do you think if Israel got to a point where it felt content, would it back off the way I suggested? And in general, I guess, what do you think's going on with the peace process over there? Do you think it's going to hold? Do you think this whole Abraham Accord is going someplace? Do you think I'm reading more into it than there actually is? Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithms brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, check out my titles. You'll find things that you'll find interesting. You should subscribe. And also, if you know somebody who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.